title of this is, as you saw, The Real Economics of Subsidies, Cui Bono, which I've just explained to Peter Mandelson means to whose good, which I pointed out had been the underlying precept of his political career. This is sadly not a new subject. The very first article in The Economist in 1843, my newspaper, was decrying the use of subsidies and tariffs to stop Brazilian wheat getting to Britain back in 1843. Now we look at the hundreds of billions of money that is spent on this. And I think we all start with an initial and easy and probably correct prejudice against subsidies of all sorts. But I think even in a brief introduction, it's worth throwing up questions about how exactly bad they are. Many of the people here who champion renewables would look at the amount of money that has been pumped into solar power in Germany and Europe and wonder whether that was money well spent. Perhaps it was. A more difficult example is kerosene. There you have a fossil fuel which we would all agree subsidizing it is a bad idea. But in some places where they've withdrawn subsidies for kerosene, people have gone out and chopped down forests to put into their cookers and things like that. And so there are subsidies, even when you want to remove them, even when you find them difficult, that are hard to do. There are subsidies that are explicit in terms of money going to people. There are subsidies that are implicit, the tax treatment of profits, allowing somebody to fish in an area which they never really sustain the true costs of. And the politics of all this, which is one reason why we have this panel, are immensely difficult. So I'm going to throw it open to the three panelists and introduce them quickly. We have Dr. Hisham Khatib, who's a former energy minister of Jordan and I think a figure in the energy for almost 50 years, I think, altogether. We have Ronald Steenblik of the OECD, who is an expert on trade and the author of many things on this subject. But we're going to begin with Peter Mandelson, a former trade commissioner, amongst many other things, and a master of the arts of politics, both implicit and explicit.
Right. Well, I have been told to cover the rather complex terrain of subsidies in precisely 10 minutes. So I will canter through, and I will do so as a politician or an ex-politician, whatever I am. But as a politician, I am, of course, by definition, an optimist. My starting point is the belief that we are taking the early steps in a journey to a new world where prosperity is spread across the globe and the world's resources are of necessity used more efficiently, and the carbon footprint is reduced. And I regard this resource conference as a kind of Baedeker guide to this new world and the journey on which we are embarked. This journey will entail at times radical, sometimes disruptive change. It will involve government and business making huge investments in cleaner, greener technologies. But the pace at which we travel to the new world will be determined by a mix of technology, business endeavor, political will, and of course, public opinion. And each of those four things tells you precisely why the pace at which we travel will not be smooth or consistent or even. So what is the place of subsidies in this journey? On the one hand, some kinds of subsidies are one of the keys to opening up the new world to which we are moving towards. But on the other hand, there are some kinds of subsidies which are one of the biggest obstacles to making progress on this journey, and I want to explain simply my view on that. Innovation, new ways of doing things, and deploying new technologies are the tools of building the new world. And I agree with John Brown in his view that technology always starts with a government subsidy one way or another. I mean, just think about it. Public investment in university science research, for example, given that we're here in Oxford. Public procurement, I mean, vast billions. Feed-in tariffs, myriad different ways in which government action and public subsidy influences how technology gets off the ground and generates innovation. And the way in which the public purse supports the generation of new ideas and fosters their transition from sort of to the marketplace and everyday use. Now, in my view, these kinds of subsidies are good. Tick. We need them, but they are only one side of the subsidy coin, I underline, but we also have to have rules in place to control, to regulate the way in which these good subsidies are used. And on the whole, as a general proposition, we should avoid permanent or perpetual subsidies. Better they are clearly limited to the time it takes technologies to progress from inception to mass commercialization. But when we look at the total amount of subsidies paid in the world, the work of the IEA and the OECD to follow up on the G20 Pittsburgh and Toronto commitments, these show that good subsidies are simply dwarfed by not so good or straightforwardly bad subsidies, the other side of the coin. Subsidies for fossil fuels run at over $400 billion a year. These subsidies encourage consumers to use fuel inefficiently and to emit more carbon. Analysis by the IEA concludes that phasing out consumption-related subsidies between 2011 and 2020 would cut CO2 emissions by the equivalent of the total current emissions of France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK combined. Now, the malign impact of bad subsidies, though, is not only, in my view, on the environment. It is, to say the least, paradoxical that fossil fuels are globally subsidized by billions of dollars in a world where over 1.3 billion people are still without access to electricity. Take the example of Indonesia, where I have been a couple of times this year and so am more exposed to what's happened in Indonesia. Indonesia has been subsidizing the retail cost of fuel since 1967. In fact, its subsidy is, in a sense, the most generous in the world. I don't know whether that includes Saudi Arabia or not. And who benefits from this? Just over half of that subsidy flows to commercial transport businesses, a half of that. About 2/5 of the remainder goes to the wealthiest 10% of households in Indonesia, 10%. While for the quarter of Indonesia's 240 8 million citizens, mainly the poorest, without the use of a vehicle, there is no direct benefit of that subsidy at all. And the Indonesian's fuel subsidy has a huge opportunity cost attached to it. The Indonesian government projects that it will spend 13% of the total budget paying this subsidy, almost as much as it spends on roads and other transport infrastructure. But this is the point. The politics of reducing subsidies is difficult, if not toxic. Earlier this year, the Indonesian government proposed to cut this subsidy amid a wave of sometimes very violent protest as people took to the streets. The Parliament predictably voted the proposal down and voted in favour of continuing this subsidy for another, what, generation, who knows. And I think this experience is salutary. I think it tells us something. And reformers, therefore, need to have a rather smarter, more canny strategy if they are to succeed and overcome not just the public opinion that often stands in the way of removing subsidies, but the myriad vested interests that stand in the way of removing subsidies as well. What are the elements of that strategy? Clearly, international community commitments and pressure to reform, to end subsidies, can create a momentum for change. A lot more transparency can help spotlight the direct and the opportunity costs of subsidies. Reform of subsidies, I suggest, shouldn't be at the cost of the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. Reform either needs to involve better targeting of subsidies or improved social safety nets to accompany their reduction or withdrawal. Getting the timing right is vital, and being willing to introduce often one-off compensatory measures to sweeten the pill. Domestic hearts and minds are the battleground for reform, and that's why reformers need to have and to communicate a compelling vision of a better post-subsidy, post-reform world. Something that even the most brilliant and imaginative and creative politicians fail to present to their public. Why would it be better? Why would our world, why would your lives be improved if we were to take these actions? Freed resources from reducing or ending bad subsidies should be invested in the building blocks of the new world, in education, in research and development, in infrastructure. We have to paint a picture, in other words, of the new world and the building blocks that we are putting in place, and why public resources, public funds, public-led investment would be better directed to those building blocks and those steps to create that better world than the one we have at the moment. So in conclusion, all of this is dependent on fraught, tense, difficult politics. One person's unjustifiable subsidy is oftentimes literally another person's livelihood or their bread and butter. I mean, sometimes literally their bread and their butter. Are there almost unbearable financial choices to be made? Yes, there are. Some of these very difficult choices are going to be faced very quickly by debt-stricken European countries, given the choices that are being forced on them. And does the law of unforeseen consequences kick in more often than not in the operation of subsidies? You bet they do.
Peter, thank you very much. We've done a very good job of introducing it. I should have said at the beginning, reflecting the bad job I did, that you have once again been sent a series of questions which you could answer and send back to us, and the key bit, I've been told, is you must press the respond keys. I'm going to use what Peter said and his basic division of this subject into, suppose, 3 areas to take a somewhat fascistic approach towards this, and to, in our panel discussion up here, to spend the first bit discussing subsidies for wasteful areas and what we can do to limit them, and then the second bit to look at subsidies for things that we basically like or support, which could go as far as education, but we'd mainly look at resources and things like that as well. And then lastly, to look at what Peter identified as the biggest problem, which is the politics of all this, what you can actually do to change the different areas. But from that point of view, I think if we could begin with the subsidies for wasteful things, things that we want to try and stop in some ways. And I'm going to come to Ronald first. You heard a long and very detailed list from Peter of things that can be done. What do you think actually makes the biggest amount of difference in these areas, and things like fossil fuels, things like water?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the first most important things that has to be done when you approach subsidies is to well, first of all, you have to have an agreed common definition on what you're dealing with. And that sounds like it's easy, but in fact, I've been in discussions many times where you get groups of countries together, and they want to go back and reinvent the wheel and come up with their own definition for subsidies in that particular sector, which I was a bit puzzled with because the WTO has a definition that's pretty serviceable. Then, of course, you need to, once you have an agreement on the definition, it helps to to actually start producing an inventory of what kind of support measures are out there, and ideally to quantify them. We at the OECD have found that when you're doing policy analysis, it's the old journalistic dictum of follow the money is extremely useful. I mean, nothing speaks louder about what the intention of a country is or a government is than how they spend their money, or how they force other people to spend their money. So it's an extremely useful tool for analyzing policies, the effects of policies, is to try to quantify the subsidies. But then a lot depends on timing. And for example, in the, I think probably everybody knows that in September 2009, the G20 leaders committed to phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that contribute to wasteful consumption. I'm using their words here. Then APEC leaders followed later that autumn. And at the time, the motivation for this was largely environmental. I mean, the references in the whole document were to the problems that Lord Mandelson just mentioned about contributing to consumption. But what we've found since, and as we've put together estimates of subsidies to fossil fuels in OECD countries, is that now there's a new interest, and that is actually countries are saying, well, that's interesting. We didn't always know about those particular programs that might have been in existence for a long time, and people stopped paying attention to it. And this might be an area where we could actually save money, either by closing a loophole or by stopping to spend money here.
And give some examples of, just rather shortly, you know, what's an example of something that, because of the deficit problems which Peter outlined, that people have actually really gone in and cut subsidies hard?
Well, examples of actual cuts are still not all that many, but there, without naming country names, there have been a few that have looked at.
Why not?
Well, I mean, for example, Canada recently phased out one of its subsidies that was encouraging, one of them, you know, that was encouraging investment in oil sands. Several other countries we know are, they haven't necessarily gone public on it, but are are looking at the exemptions for fossil fuels for particular centers.
What do you think is actually really, going back to Peter's initial points, and I bring Hisham in as well, what do you think is really stopping them? I mean, you have a cast iron case, you have something which is not doing the world good, you have the fact that governments are running out of money. What is the main thing that actually stops it?
It varies from sector to sector. I mean, what's stopping in agriculture, I think, is somewhat different than what's stopping it in say, fossil fuels. I mean, everywhere you always have the problem of the first mover. A lot of countries are under pressure from their particular sectors, especially if they've been giving subsidies for a long time. Then you have a very informed, very active group that is, is very attuned to any threat to that reform. And one of the first things they point out, of course, is, well, if you eliminate this tax loophole, for example, that everybody else has this, and we're going to, shift more of our resources to drilling in this country or producing in that country, or whatever. In the case of agriculture, and this goes for a lot of subsidies, you have what one economist 50 years ago called the transitional gains trap. And that is that very often subsidies will be provided, but what happens is they get capitalized into the value of fixed assets. So for example, subsidies for food prices end up basically increasing the value of farmland. So new farmers come along, they buy the farmland, they're paying now a higher price because they're going to get a higher return. And now if you withdraw that subsidy, they're going to be real losers because they've now paid a lot more for that farmland than the previous farmer who got a windfall profit when the subsidy was introduced.
And is this the kind of thing which you've seen on the ground level? You famously did a lot of stuff in Jordan when you were there.
Well, the subsidies lobby is one of the strongest political forces in any country. And any decision maker would think twice or three times before doing anything about pricing already established prices. Even if the world prices go up, the local response would be delayed if ever it comes, because subsidies are well entrenched in the society, in the street. Not only, and decision makers has got to think more than once, because has got to think intensively before doing anything about them. It's only becomes a last resort when the country is almost going to go bankrupt, to go into loans, to go into financial difficulty, that the lawmaker would move ahead and do something about subsidies. So the best thing about subsidies is not to get involved on them in the first instance. Avoid them if you can. But this is easier than done. For instance, in our country, we didn't subsidize fuels in the 10 years ago. Price of oil was $25, $30. Now, price of oil is $100, $125. So you have to bring up the price of fuels by 4 or 5 times. This is not easy to do. This is almost impossible to do. So the lobby, particularly in the street, is so strong that inhibits you, handcuffs you from doing the right economic decisions. And
does the international, I mean, particularly looking at Peter, does the international side of people coming in, organizations like the European Union saying that you have to stop subsidies if you remotely want to think about joining us, does that make any difference at all to a politician in a country like Jordan? It
does, no doubt about that. And it's not only the European Union, but more important, the IMF and the World Bank. And of course, they no doubt have got a voice, and they assist the decision makers in taking the right decisions. No doubt about that. But even then, you can't phase out all subsidies. What you can do is to ensure that subsidies goes only to the poor. And that can be done. There is no problem in that. For instance, we have got what we call tiers in electricity. The first far of 200 kilowatt hours are sold at subsidized price. After that, you are overpriced to compensate for that. Water is a little bit much more difficult, at least in our country. There is not enough water to go for everybody. So what can you do is rationing. It might look a surprise to a lot of listeners that in our country, which has got, let us say, middle class or upper middle class level of life, water is allowed in summer only 1 day a week. And this is provided at a high price, $0.50 per meter cube. The incremental cost of water is $1, but still $0.50 is a high price for water. But even then, a lot of people would take much more than what the water wealth of the country will allow them to do. So you have to ration. Rationing by giving people water 1 day a week. So they have got to store the water for the rest of the week.
Can I bring Ronald and Peter in on this? Do you both think that a common answer to resource problems is effectively what you've said, which is to give poor people a certain amount of free or heavily subsidized things, and then everything beyond a certain point to be priced more aggressively? To use the example of energy, for instance, and also water to some extent.
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it.
Peter, do you think there's anything in that?
Yes, I do. I think it's very important. It's important both as a policy for sort of resource sustainability, but also for redistribution. You will, of course, always be faced with a rather ticklish problem about where, in the hierarchy of incomes, your subsidy stops kicking in, and where it goes over a cliff. But that's a difficult decision. That's not a reason for not taking the decision.
I think it depends. In countries that are reasonably advanced and have advanced tax systems, I mean, as we heard from the minister from Singapore yesterday talking about water, they don't have lifeline tariffs. They charge full price to everybody, and they try to make up for that extra cost through general income support. And in our own OECD countries, we would probably say that that's a better way than to have some kind of means-tested lifeline rates for electricity, water, or whatever. There are nonetheless some member countries of the OECD who do have these kinds of lifeline rates. It does get you into, can get you into very large administrative burden, and then you have kind of perverse responses of people breaking up houses, where actually a big family lives, but they break it into little individual units and each have a meter in order to pay the lower rate.
Did that happen in Jordan? Did people try to game the system that you brought in to try and restrict subsidies?
That's why I said in case of water, you have to do rationing. In case of electricity, you only subsidize the basic needs. Let us say 200 kilowatt hours each month. After that, you have got to get the incremental cost of the facility. Otherwise, the country would be in real trouble, really. So even in food now, we have got what we call the intelligent cards, which would allow you to buy food or you buy even kerosene at a reasonable amount. Beyond that, you have got to buy it in the commercial market, which are much higher than the subsidized market. So there are modern facilities which would ensure that the subsidy goes only to the poor. Now, in our case, in Jordan, I mean, kerosene is not heavily subsidized, but the amount of subsidy, 80% go to the rich, only 20% go to the poor. So that only demonstrates the extent of the problem. Only 1/5 of the subsidy benefits the poor. 4/5 go to the rich, and that applies to a lot of other commodities.
There's anything to do with the way that these time limits can be oppressed? Peter brought up the idea that any subsidy which came through, there should be a time limit set on how long that lasts for. Did you try that at all? Or Ronald, do you see any sign of that working at all?
Who do you want first?
Hisham.
In case of Jordan, I mean, you can't face the subsidies easily. I said it's a very strong, powerful lobby. What you can do is doing this entire business. Basic uses are subsidized. Other uses, you have got to get the real price of it. You can't, even as you rightly said, there are people who are willing to pay any price for the commodity. So the only, like in water, the only answer is rationing. You have got to give them only a certain amount a month or a week.
Yeah, on time limits, they're sort of standard textbook recommendation, and in theory they can work well, but what I've seen in looking at a lot of programs around the world is oftentimes it's very easy to get around them. The classic one, perhaps, is the subsidy for corn ethanol in the United States. I mean, when that was introduced, first as a tax break in 1978, it was limited. And then it got renewed and renewed and renewed and renewed, and only finally disappeared at the end of last year. And what some people have pointed out is that when you do have these kind of time limits, sometimes it makes basically other legislators complacent. And they say, well, okay, this is only going to be for a short while. We won't really bother too much in this. So it's a double-edged sword.
Perhaps we can just, before going to questions from the audience, just very quickly, just on my other subject, the good subsidies, which Peter brought up, and one has to remember that at least the people who thought the more or less murderous ethanol subsidy was actually one aimed at a good thing. What have you learned so far in terms of when you are trying to target things, say like solar power, say like wind power?
Yeah.
What sort of subsidies work best like that, and which ones have done the best work?
Well, I mean, I'd say obviously the first step is to try to get rid of any subsidies to the things you don't want that are working against that. Okay. I mean, again, to come back to this issue of the transitional gains trap, where often you get lock-in is where it kind of becomes part of the ongoing business model. And that the one thing you can say about capital-related subsidies is that when you cut them off, there aren't any losers. I mean, the only losers are people who are planning to make some investment in the future and now they can't. So from that standpoint, it has that advantage from a political economy standpoint. I mean, we work...
So in practice, if you were trying to do wind power or solar power, you would give capital things to the people building the actual initial...
Yeah, I mean, what I know, and for example, in some countries, they've felt, well, that's not enough because you have also the possibility that somebody may install them and then they don't work in the end. So most countries also have some kind of production-related subsidy there, and I understand that. But what we're most concerned about are trade-distorting ones. And so I would say that definitely whatever ones are used, they should avoid basically imposing local content obligations as a associated policy, and that the ones that are related to the installation or the demand side are probably the least trade distorting. So things like feed-in tariffs as opposed to production subsidies.
Yes, but I mean the important thing is to realize in the case of good subsidies that you may turn out to be wrong. I always remember when in the commission, I think it was a combination of the Environment Commissioner and the Agriculture Commissioner came to the college one week with a proposal to introduce biofuels tariffs to protect European production of biofuels. And I, of course, was very unenthusiastic about this. I'm not madly in favour of yet more tariffs, being the Trade Commissioner. I took some persuading. But eventually, I gave my agreement on the basis that it would be a sort of short-term, temporary tariff, ho-ho, but one that was probably justified to enable home European biofuels producers to sort of get off the ground and help them, grow their production and make it more efficient so that they could compete internationally. A year later, I think it was probably the same two commissioners who came to the college and said, we've got to get rid of these tariffs are terrible, these biofuels are awful, they're sort of converting food production to fuel production, they are energy and water inefficient, and so it's an illustration of why when you want to commend the good, as it were, and you want to support a good objective, you must keep it under rather close scrutiny, because sometimes the science can fool you.
Very good example. We should go to questions, and there's Avery's got a question here.
There are two little anecdotes that might suggest a way forward on the political challenge that Lord Mandelson suggested. One was in Oklahoma, where Governor David Walters wanted to build a toll highway and was criticized for charging people for what had always been a free good. And he turned around the politics by saying there are two kinds of roads, tax-supported roads and user-supported roads. Which kind do you want? There are no free roads. And he won the argument. Secondly, we have a heavily rural American state where the rural legislators had such power they got a special deal that they could get electricity forever at the same price as the big cities, even though the production cost was 7 times higher for them because they ran on diesels. And this was starting to break the bank. So we did an experiment back in the 80s, taking a village and improving its electric end-use efficiency by a factor 7. So if you took some of the money you were putting into subsidy, put it into efficiency instead, the price could go up 7-fold, the usage would go down 7-fold, the bill would remain the same, and you wouldn't be breaking the bank anymore, and the Treasury would get its investment back in a few years. They didn't do it, but I understand now that oil prices are a great deal higher. They're looking back at that experience.
Reaction?
No, I think it was actually a point I wanted to make also, that there are a lot of these kinds of subsidies that are aimed at enabling poor people to be able to purchase energy or water, whatever, and in developed countries. And Amory Lovins probably knows better about the LIHEAP program in the United States, but I believe that they're also now spending some money on trying to weatherize some of the houses that were recipients of this. But yeah, generally, I mean, if at the very least, if you have these kinds of programs, it seems smart to try to use as much as you can of the funds to actually reduce the demand and the need for those things in the first place, rather than just having an open-ended, indefinite kind of subsidization.
Right, we should go to another question in the audience, but I'm just going to fire one from which has come in on the iPad, and that is, how widely can the reallocation of rights be used to replace subsidies when you look at things like fisheries? Is there a way of actually moving things by changing who owns what rather than actually the amount of money going to them?
Determined by who? Who determines their rights?
The European Union, I would imagine, in fisheries here.
The European Union doesn't do it in isolation from the rest of the world. I mean, a lot of our disputes were with others where rights, in inverted commas, were conflicting. So who determines the rights? Who polices them? Who enforces? Who arbitrates?
I mean, certainly it's helped in coastal fisheries that are not international fisheries. I mean, it's usually usually it's done by the government, but there are many fisheries around the world that are relatively local. The classic one often cited is the lobster fishery off of New England, where it was basically self-organized and self-policed. But yeah, definitely, I mean, fisheries are natural resources. They generate economic rents, or they could generate economic rents. And in fact, if anything, we should be getting more revenue from fisheries. And instead, in many cases, basically, we've subsidized the fishing to a point where it's generating no economic rent, and everybody's worse off.
Hi, my name is Bernice Lee. I'm with Chatham House in London. It's here. I just thought this panel is a very good reminder that markets for energy, food, and water have always been intensely political. And therefore, in some ways, while I'm really grateful for all the business leadership that we see today, is a really strong reminder as well how we cannot possibly give up on governments, and that they will continue to play a very important role in shaping these markets. But also, I wonder sometimes whether or not it is just about subsidies, or if government and intervention indeed are the norms rather than the exception in these markets, then is it as much about just getting the basics right, you know, the environmental social policies, rather than just about subsidies per se, which is only ultimately a tool for shaping a lot of these markets in the first place?
I think what we're trying to do is focus.
But the only qualification, of course, I love government. You know, great, can't wait to get back. But I'm afraid
that requires other people's.
Yeah, and for my part, at least, looking increasingly likely. But anyway, put that aside for one moment. The point about government in making markets is that you can't really make those markets unilaterally or nationally. That's the point. And that's why intergovernment, international agreement is absolutely vital when you're making markets. And it is, of course, so difficult to do, and agreement eludes us because everyone feels that somebody else is undeserving or taking an excessive advantage, or you know, and they're undeserving, etc. And so it's really very difficult indeed. And it's, you know, I go back to the panel earlier in the morning about politics and in economics. You know, I was very sympathetic to a lot of the wishful thinking that was expressed in that panel. But it is the politics of what is possible rather than the politics of what is ideal which we are dealing with in these matters. Of course, we need to make markets. But the moment governments get involved, they not only, oftentimes, if they act nationally and unilaterally, face costs that make them uncompetitive and therefore face consequent problems for their own economies and their own decision-making and politics as a result of that. But also, any government intervention in any market is a rather blunt instrument. It is very difficult to get regulation right, and when you have ministers and markets mixing in that way, it's even more difficult to get.
Can I follow up, particularly for you and Hisham, on one thing? There's a number of questions which have come in which basically make the same point, that isn't the really difficult thing in this getting around special interests. There's a number of people saying, isn't the big gorilla in the room the inappropriately massive political influence of vested interests which get in the way? And people are asking, I suppose particularly you two, is whether you give examples of how you get round.
I mean, let me give you an example of what you could describe as a vested interest. 10, 15 years ago in Britain, some wise minister or set of civil servants decided that it was important for government to do more to get behind the research and development and production of advanced, lightweight composite materials. Incidentally, equally unwise ministers and civil servants had overlooked the need to do this, and Britain fell behind, and indeed it was in danger of falling out of, you know, wing production in Airbus manufacture altogether. Now, would Britain's success in producing now very wide range of applications of those composite materials have taken place without some sort of wise public intervention, just putting some sort of support, financial support behind that R&D? Or could you say that the recipients and beneficiaries of that public intervention were an undeserving vested interest who were simply thinking about themselves, their own commercial opportunity, and the profit they could make from that? What is a vested interest?
I agree it's hard, but if you took, just very quickly to narrow in on you and come to Hisham as well, to use an example with you, a vested interest from which, a lobby from which I suppose I should admit I personally have gained and other guys considerably, the agricultural lobby. I mean, give an example of how you try to get round that when you're actually dealing within the corridors of power.
Well, that is, of course, a European community issue, not a national issue. And there's been a great deal of reform. I mean, farmers have received more subsidies in Europe, obviously, than any other group. And, you know, the process and the mechanics and the politics of adjustment is very fraught. But we've managed it. But we have taken a decision. Actually, it's one that, unusually for a British politician, I supported. I like the idea of rural life and living livelihoods being sustained. I like the idea of a countryside which people could not just live in but leave urban areas to enjoy. I like the idea of farming and sustainable agriculture and good food. Obviously, it conflicted with my policies and principles as a trade commissioner, because I was forever wanting to reduce the tariffs, the subsidies, the price distortions. I wanted to trade those into the mix, not least because I wanted to see opportunities for farming and agriculture growing in Africa, developing countries and around the world. So you have to sort of resolve these difficult dilemmas, but there is not simply one set of policy objectives. There are a number, and you have to balance them.
Hisham, is that your experience?
Well, I would like really to go back into markets, because this is very important, and particularly subsidies for fossil fuels have changed the world markets. Now, all heavy industries like steel, aluminium, petrochemicals, and all that are moving into developing countries like the Gulf countries, China, India, where energy is cheap. And all these industries are energy intensive. So the production of these heavy industries are now being traded into the OECD countries, reducing the energy use in OECD countries. So the subsidies really proliferated. The benefits of these subsidies proliferated into the OECD, resulting in them having outputs which are much cheaper than they have been produced locally, and also reduce their emissions. Now, OECD countries will tell you that our carbon emissions are levelized. This is not the case. They have levelized because heavy industries have moved from them into developing countries, into subsidized, fossil fuel subsidized developing countries. We have to look into what we call embedded emissions. And when we go into usage, into consumption, well, I don't think there have been any levelizing in emissions in OECD.
Do you want to just define embedded emissions for the people here?
Beg pardon?
Do you want to define embedded emissions?
Well, embedded emission is not the amount of energy or carbon you emit, but the amount of carbon embedded or used in your consumption. And if you are producing steel in China, which is happening now, or petrochemicals in the Gulf, and having them in OECD countries, well, these countries, China and the Gulf, are emitting on behalf of the OECD countries.
Do you think the poor world, to some extent the rich world, has had its time in trade? We burnt a lot of fossil fuels, we created industries, and now we're trying to boss you around in these areas and trying to persuade more emerging countries to do things, not to do things that we ourselves did. Do you think there's a degree of hypocrisy from the West?
I won't go to that extreme, very honestly.
I would.
But I see that subsidized prices of energy in these countries, China, India, and the Gulf countries, has meant that heavy industries moved from the OECD, from the West, into these countries and allow them to market or export products which are much cheaper have they been produced in OECD countries. That resulted in these countries having higher carbon emission, and the OECD countries have reduced emissions. So we have to think in terms of embedded emissions. And really, it's OECD countries, which are, to a certain extent, are benefiting from subsidies in these energy-rich countries. There is a proliferation of energy subsidies from these energy-rich countries into OECD countries. We have to recognize this.
I think there's some truth to what he says. I think it's a mixed story. I mean, I think it is important when we look at, for example, the degree to which some countries have reduced their emissions on paper. You know, from a national perspective, oftentimes it's because they've closed down, especially small countries, because they've closed down particularly heavy polluting industries. But that said, I don't think we always necessarily need to look at the fact that some industries are setting up in developing countries that it means they're necessarily more polluting. Some of the most energy efficient aluminum plants in the world are now being built in developing countries. So, but I mean, I think it's as a general point, it's an important one. Yeah.
Question from the audience.
And sometimes with Western technology and Western capital
Absolutely.
in developing countries. So
Absolutely.
that when sometimes, you know, when people say, oh my God, you know, we can't make the sacrifice, we can't move first, we can't do something unilaterally, we have sometimes to bear in mind that A, we have a responsibility to lead. Secondly, that when you make, you know, unilateral actions or concessions. It's like unilaterally giving up trade tariffs, for example. You can find that, you know, a sort of self-selecting liberalization then sort of transmits or migrates its way eventually to a multilateral agreement. You can't quite see how or what precise course it will take or when, but you believe that the action that you take in the first place will eventually have that effect. And similarly, when you take an action in your own country, which you arguably is at the cost of your own competitiveness or at your own cost of your own economy, you are at the same time having to bear in mind that you are investing elsewhere and in another country, in another economy, in the way that Ronald has described, and you're deriving an economic benefit from that. It may be longer term, and you may not be able to sort of catalogue precisely when it's going to arrive, but you are going to get a benefit from that.
I push you each on, and then I will come to the questions that we asked the audience. Can I push you each on one word, which is transparency? Peter mentioned it at the beginning. It's cropped up a couple of times since, and it's in a lot of the questions here. People tend to think that transparency with subsidies makes a huge difference. Is that really true, or do people just simply not bother to see it, even when it's there?
It's absolutely true. I mean, in a water bill in our country, it tells you you are paying so-and-so, but the real cost is so-and-so. So you shouldn't complain. It's very essential that transparency should be apparent in not only in the press, but also in the bills, telling the consumer, we are subsidizing you to so-and-so extent. Please.
See that as well, Ronald?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, particularly we're looking at it from an international standpoint, and in all the cases where you've had international, or at least the beginning of international action on subsidies, it's been prefaced by a major exercise to provide transparency in a consistent way, you know, across a number of countries. So and what's different now, though, than say back in the 1980s when the OECD was first putting together its estimates of producer support to agriculture, is now so much more is available on the web. And so NGOs will have shown that they're able to put together this information on subsidies, even if the governments or intergovernmental organizations don't.
I think another point about transparency is that the more you can see something, examine it, analyze it, and discover its consequences, the better designed and more efficient it's likely to be. So that the more opaque it is, you know, probably more often than not it's going to be less well designed. I mean, and I think that in the renewables area, you know, there is an issue here, and my fear slightly in Europe is we're about to see a sort of collision between possibly intransparent, possibly ill-designed and inefficient subsidies of energy renewables colliding with the very stark, very sharp choices that sovereigns are now facing to reduce their public spending. And that is going to have an effect not only directly on the particular renewable source of energy that is attracting the subsidy, but it can lead to a contagion of investment sort of confidence collapse, a sudden sort of burst of uncertainty, which would be catastrophic, in my view, for Europe's development of renewables. The other day, there was a suggestion, a proposal floated in one of the Spanish economic newspapers, suggesting that not only would the sort of subsidy for solar be phased out, but a sort of retrospective tax would be introduced. Now, that is sort of death to investor confidence. And if it were to happen, I don't know whether it is or not, I'm not privy, but if it were, you can see how that would sort of trigger a sort of domino reaction as investor confidence in one sort of renewable sector area of research, development, production after another suddenly became fearful that under the impact of the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, we were suddenly going to see a sudden sharp withdrawal of subsidies, or even worse, the introduction of retrospective taxes. Now, this is an area of subsidy and taxation which is absolutely fraught with danger in the road that we are seeking to take to get us to the world that we want to end up in.
That's a very good place to end, and indeed I think will be a big issue, not least in Britain actually, I think, where a lot of the renewable energy seems to have gone to people in very large houses. I was going to quickly look at the three questions you've been asked. The first one was actually one where you asked for a vote, basically, and there were three different options. Subsidies are a market distortion and should be removed. Subsidies are okay if they're phased out over time, and subsidies are a market distortion, and you seem to have voted quite heavily for the one where they're phased out over time, so Peter has to some extent won that. The second one is, according to the IEA, what percentage of total fossil fuel subsidies is directed towards the poorest 8%, and the answer actually is 15%. I'm not sure, I haven't got up yet how you did vote on that, but the answer was 15%. You were given a choice out of 15%, 40%, 60%, or 80%. And the final question is, what is the ratio of subsidies spent on fossil fuels to those spent on renewables? And the answer is 5 to 1, which by itself is rather impressive. I have one lasting criticism to direct at the panels. One of the questions said, why are the panels so dominated by men when women suffer most? Unfortunately, we were unable to deal with that, but all the same, I would like to thank all three of you, Peter, Hisham, and Ronald, very much for your time. And we now go to lunch, which I think is where tea was yesterday. Thank you.